A great civilization once thrived in the heart of the Central American rainforest, only to vanish beneath the jungle canopy. This is the enduring mystery of the Maya collapse, a story not of a single day, but of a slow fading that still puzzles us today. By the end of this journey, you will understand the complex web of reasons behind one of history's most fascinating disappearances. We will explore how environmental shifts and political strife conspired to silence magnificent cities. Why did a people so advanced in astronomy and architecture simply walk away from their stone palaces? What does the quiet fall of a kingdom teach us about our own world? The rainforest itself seemed to hold its breath around these cities. Canopies of emerald green opened to reveal vast plazas paved with white stone, where the sounds of daily life echoed against towering pyramids. In the great city of Tikal, temples pierced the sky, their limestone facades glowing under the tropical sun. These structures were not just buildings, they were man-made mountains, a testament to a people who sought to reach the heavens. The air in these ceremonial centers hummed with activity, from the scent of copal incense rising from temple tops to the bustling markets below where artisans traded jade and obsidian. This was the Maya world at its peak, a civilization in full flower during what scholars call the Classic period. Its heart beat in dozens of independent city-states, each ruled by a divine king, a Kuhul Ajor, who served as the sacred link between the people and the gods. In places like Palenque, architects and artists achieved a breathtaking elegance. They engineered aqueducts to channel fresh water and designed palaces with vaulted ceilings that seemed to defy their stone weight. Their courtyards were adorned with intricate stucco sculptures depicting gods, kings, and the sacred stories of creation. Life was ordered by a deep understanding of the cosmos. Scribes working in quiet rooms recorded history and calculated time using a complex interlocking of 3 separate calendars. The long count tracked vast epochs, the Hob matched the solar year for agriculture, and the Tzolk'in, a 260-day sacred cycle, guided rituals and ceremonies. This was not a quiet, isolated world. It was a vibrant network of competing and cooperating cities, connected by trade, royal marriages, and sometimes war. Ball courts hosted a ritual game that was far more than sport, its outcome believed to influence the very balance of the world. In this serene and structured world, the idea of collapse would have seemed impossible. The rhythm of life, from planting maize to venerating the king, felt as permanent as the pyramids themselves. Yet this golden age, for all its splendor, was built upon a foundation that was both brilliant and, in ways no one could then foresee, deeply fragile. Yet this deep connection to the land was also the source of a profound vulnerability. The Maya world was not a place of endless abundance, but a delicate balance of sun and rain. The great cities were cradled in a seasonal rainforest, a landscape that thrived on a predictable rhythm of wet and dry periods. The entire agricultural cycle, the very foundation that fed millions, was timed to the arrival of the life-giving summer rains. When the skies opened on schedule, water collected in vast artificial reservoirs, nourishing the maize, beans, and squash that sustained the population. But what happens when that rhythm falters? Scientists studying sediment cores from nearby lakes have uncovered a startling story written in mud and minerals. These natural archives reveal that the centuries of the Maya peak coincided with an unusually wet and stable climate. Then, as the Classic period progressed, the whispers began. The first signs were likely subtle, a dry season that lingered a little too long, a rainy period that was less generous than the one before. A series of droughts began to punctuate the climate record, each one a little more severe than the last. We are not talking about a single year of poor rainfall, but prolonged periods of aridity that could stretch for a decade or more. You can almost feel the growing anxiety. A farmer watching the sky day after day, waiting for clouds that do not form. the water level in the community reservoir slowly, inexorably begins to drop. The maize plants in the field, once vibrant and green, start to wilt under the relentless sun. For a society so densely populated, a water shortfall was not merely an inconvenience, it was a direct threat to survival. The same ingenuity that carved cities from the jungle now faced its ultimate test. The environmental stress was like a constant, low hum in the background of Maya life, a pressure that would soon begin to amplify the cracks in their political and social world. The first signs of collapse were not loud or dramatic. They were quiet shifts, subtle tremors in the foundation of society that went unrecorded in the grand stone inscriptions. In the art of the time, a new and more menacing theme began to appear. Carvings on stone monuments or stelae, which once glorified a king's divine birth or his ritual acts, started to depict him as a warrior. He was shown standing triumphantly over bound captives, his power now measured not just by his connection to the gods, but by his martial prowess. The sacred ball game, once a ritual reenactment of creation, seems to have taken on a darker, more desperate tone. Carvings from this period suggest the stakes of the game were rising, with its outcome possibly deciding the fate of entire cities and their rulers. This rising tension bled into the very structure of daily life. The gap between the elite and the common people, always present, appears to have widened into a chasm. Archaeologists see this in the remains of households. The grand palaces of the nobility were fortified and expanded, their walls growing thicker, as if the rulers were building fortresses within their own cities. Meanwhile, the simple thatched roof homes of the farmers show increasing signs of hardship. The bones of commoners reveal poorer nutrition and the stresses of a more difficult life. It seems the burden of supporting the lavish court and its ambitious building projects was falling ever more heavily on those who could least afford it. Even the lifeblood of the civilization, its trade networks, began to falter. The flow of prized goods like jade from the highlands, obsidian for razor-sharp tools, and brilliantly colored quetzal feathers for royal headdresses became less reliable. What was once a steady river of commerce shrunk to a trickle. A potter in a smaller city might find they could no longer obtain the specific type of clay their family had used for generations. A farmer might have to make do with a stone tool because the obsidian blades were now too expensive or simply unavailable. These were the quiet frustrations of a world slowly fraying at the edges, long before the central fabric tore. The system was showing its first hairline cracks, a silent scream from the cities that the grand stone monuments could not utter. These quiet frustrations were soon amplified by a force far greater than any king. The sky itself began to withhold its blessing. The leading explanation for the Maya collapse points not to a single cataclysm, but to a slow, relentless squeeze, a series of severe, multi-decade droughts that strangled the civilization. The evidence for this is not found in ancient texts, but locked deep within the landscape itself. Scientists have turned to natural archives, pulling long cores of sediment from the bottom of lakes like Chichen Itza in Mexico. These muddy layers are a timeline of the past, and within them, the story is stark. By analyzing the chemistry of the sediment, researchers can measure the past presence of water. The layers that correspond to the peak of the Classic period show a wet, stable environment. But then, as the 9th century dawned, the record changes dramatically. The chemistry shifts, indicating the lake waters were evaporating, becoming saltier and shallower. The data suggests a series of profound drying periods, each one lasting for several years, with the most severe hitting around the time the great cities were being abandoned for good. This story of a changing climate is echoed in another silent witness, deep within the caves of the region. Stalagmites, those stone fingers growing up from cave floors, are formed drop by drop over centuries. Each layer holds a chemical signature of the rain that fell at the time. By slicing a stalagmite open and reading these chemical bands, scientists can reconstruct a year-by-year rainfall record going back over 1,000 years. The findings are chilling. They confirm a pattern of rainfall that was not just low but persistently, devastatingly low during the critical final century of the classic Maya. The climate was not merely fluctuating, it was undergoing a catastrophic shift. The reliable summer rains that fed the reservoirs and watered the maize fields became heartbreakingly unreliable. Imagine the profound psychological impact of this. A society built on the precise timing of celestial and seasonal cycles now watched its central pillar, the rain, falter and fail. The divine king, the Kuhul Ajor, was the intermediary between the people and the gods, responsible for ensuring the rains came and the crops grew. When the prayers and ceremonies at the pyramid tops no longer brought the life-giving storms, the very foundation of political and spiritual authority began to crumble into dust. The drought did not just cause a food shortage, it triggered a crisis of faith, leaving a civilization spiritually parched and utterly vulnerable. The maize fields were the civilization's true heart, and the drought struck directly at this vital center. A farmer in the late classic period would have watched their world turn to dust. The first sign was the soil itself, cracking under a sun that seemed harsher with each passing season. The young maize plants, the sacred crop that was the foundation of every meal, would have grown stunted and brittle, their leaves curling inward to conserve what little moisture remained. A single season of poor yield could be weathered, but when the rains failed again and again, the result was not just hunger but a cascading famine. The carefully managed surpluses stored in granaries would have been emptied. The diet, once rich with maize, beans and squash, would have dwindled to foraged roots and whatever small game remained. You can see the evidence of this in the bones from this era, which show clear signs of chronic malnutrition and stress in the general population. This scarcity ripped at the social fabric. The trust that bound the common people to their divine king would have evaporated as quickly as the water from the reservoirs. What good was a ruler who could no longer command the skies? The farmers, the artisans, the laborers who built the pyramids were now facing the starvation of their own children. The authority of the elite, built on the promise of prosperity and cosmic order, crumbled into a desperate struggle for survival. This agricultural collapse made the great cities untenable. Urban centers like Tikal and Kopan were densely populated, their very existence dependent on a constant, massive influx of food from the surrounding countryside. When that flow stopped, the city became a death trap. There was no reason to remain in a place of stone and ceremony when the land could no longer feed you. The social contract was broken. The gradual abandonment was not an act of mystery, but one of grim necessity. People had to leave to find water and food, scattering back into smaller, more manageable family groups in the forest, returning to a way of life that did not rely on the failing power of kings. The great silence that followed in the cities was not peaceful. It was the sound of a society unraveling from the ground up. The king's divine authority was a brilliant solution for building a civilization, but a terrible one for saving one. Maya kingship was not merely a political office, it was the very pillar of cosmic order. The Kuhul Ajor, the Holy Lord, was not just a ruler, he was the vital link between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. His most sacred duty was to perform the rituals and bloodletting ceremonies that ensured the sun would rise, the rains would fall, and the cycle of life would continue. For centuries, this system worked. The king's perceived power was validated by prosperity, by full harvests, and by victorious wars. But this created a political structure with no room for error, no plan B. The entire worldview was built on a single, unshakable premise: the king's ability to intercede with the gods. When the droughts began their relentless march, that premise shattered. How could a farmer continue to believe in a divine king when the king's prayers left the fields cracked and barren? The failure of the rains was not seen as a natural disaster, it was seen as a divine rejection. The king had lost the favor of the gods, and in doing so, he lost the mandate to rule. This crisis of faith was amplified by the very nature of the Maya political landscape. This was not a unified empire with a single emperor, but a fractured world of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own divine king. Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palinque were not allies in a common cause. They were rivals locked in a perpetual struggle for power and resources. Their history is written on stone monuments as a saga of shifting alliances, royal marriages, and brutal wars. When the environmental crisis deepened, this rivalry became a fatal flaw. Instead of uniting to face a common threat, the city-states likely turned inward, hoarding their dwindling resources and competing even more fiercely for what little remained. A king facing starvation in his own city could not send aid to a neighbor. He might even be tempted to raid them for food. The political system, designed for competition and ceremony, was utterly ill-equipped for collaboration and survival. The response of the elites only made things worse. As the pressure mounted, the kings and nobles appear to have doubled down on the very rituals that were failing. They commissioned more monuments glorifying their own lineage. They embarked on even more ambitious construction projects, perhaps in a desperate attempt to prove their undiminished power to their people and to their rivals. But every block of stone for a new pyramid required labor taken from the fields. Every grand ceremony consumed resources that were desperately needed for survival. The common people, who for generations had offered their labor and loyalty in exchange for prosperity and cosmic order, were now being asked to sacrifice for a bargain that was clearly broken. The political collapse was not a single event, but a slow, city-by-city failure. One by one, the carving of royal monuments ceased. The last dated stela at a great city is not a declaration of war or a celebration of a birth. It is often a simple, final marker after which there is only silence. The people did not revolt in a violent uprising. They simply walked away. They withdrew their belief, and then they withdrew their labor. They left the stone plazas and empty pyramids behind, not because they forgot how to live in cities, but because the idea of the city and the king at its heart had failed them. The political order had proven too rigid, too brittle to bend under the weight of a changing world. The silence of the abandoned cities is broken by the grim evidence of their final days. Across the Maya world, the stone itself tells a story of rising fear and desperation. Archaeologists find that the grand causeways which once welcomed traders and pilgrims were suddenly blocked. Great walls of rough-cut stone were hastily erected across these ceremonial avenues, turning open plazas into fortified compounds. In cities like Tikal, the very heart of the royal palace was transformed into a defensive stronghold, its access points narrowed to choke points where a few defenders could hold off a mob. This was not the architecture of confidence and power, but the architecture of siege. The people were no longer building monuments to the heavens, they were building barricades against their neighbors. The conflict turned inward with a horrifying intimacy. At the site of Cancrain, a once prosperous trading center, a grisly discovery was made in the palace reservoir. The skeletons of dozens of elite men, women, and children were found heaped together, their bones showing the brutal marks of execution. These were not warriors fallen in battle, but the royal court itself, slaughtered and discarded in the water that once symbolized life and abundance. This was not a foreign invasion, but a paroxysm of internal violence, a clear sign that the social order had shattered completely. The rivalry between city-states, once managed through ritual ball games and royal marriages, now descended into total war. The goal was no longer capturing nobles for ritual sacrifice, but seizing the last remaining stores of food and water. A victorious army would not just take captives, they would strip a rival city of everything edible, condemning the survivors to starvation. The inscriptions from this era, fewer and more frantic, shift from celebrating births and anniversaries to recording the capture and humiliation of enemy kings. The very concept of kingship was being dragged through the mud as the divine lords were paraded in bonds, their sacred power broken by the mundane reality of hunger and the sword. This spiral of violence created a feedback loop of destruction. Each successful raid only deepened the resource shortage for the next city, guaranteeing further conflict. Trust evaporated entirely, making any form of regional cooperation to combat the drought an impossible dream. Why share your last reservoir with a neighbor who might poison it tomorrow? The sound of conflict, from the clatter of stones being piled into defensive walls to the final, desperate cries from a palace courtyard, was the sound of a civilization consuming itself. The environment had provided the pressure, but it was this human response, this turn upon one another, that ultimately broke the Maya world into 1,000 irreconcilable pieces. A city like Tikal was not an island. It was a node in a vast, humming web of exchange that stretched across the entire Maya world and beyond. Think of the intricate roads known as Sakbiob that connected cities and the canoes that plied the coasts, carrying not just luxury items, but the absolute necessities of life. This network was the civilization's circulatory system, and when it faltered, the entire body began to shut down. The first sign of trouble was the silence on the roads. Where once there was the constant movement of porters carrying heavy loads, now the causeways grew still. The flow of goods that every city depended on began to slow to a trickle and then stopped altogether. This was not merely an inconvenience for the elite, it was a catastrophic breakdown. Consider the humble but essential piece of obsidian. This volcanic glass, sourced from only a few quarries in the highlands, was the sharpest material available. It was the razor blade, the surgical scalpel, and the butcher's knife of its time. Farmers used obsidian blades to harvest crops. Artisans used it for fine carving. Hunters relied on it to skin game. Without a steady supply, a city's basic ability to process food and materials was crippled. People would have been forced to make do with less effective stone tools, making every task more difficult and time-consuming, further reducing the efficiency of a society already under immense strain. The same was true for salt, a fundamental nutrient for life and the primary means of preserving food in a tropical climate. Major salt works along the coast produced this vital commodity, and it was traded inland in a constant, essential flow. As the trade routes collapsed, this supply would have dried up. The ability to preserve fish or meat for lean times vanished. Diets would have become even more monotonous and less nutritious, and the risk of foodborne illness would have risen. The absence of salt was a quiet, insidious emergency that weakened the population from within. Then there was jade. To the Maya, jade was more than a pretty stone. It was the embodiment of life, wind, and the sacred breath of the soul. It was the ultimate symbol of royal and divine power, carved into intricate masks, ear spools, and pendants for the king and his court. The cessation of jade trade was a spiritual and political catastrophe. It meant the rituals that affirmed the king's power could no longer be performed with the proper sacred objects. A king without access to new jade was like a priest without a holy text, his authority visibly diminished. The economic dominoes fell one after another. The potter in a lowland city could no longer get the specific clays or pigments they needed. The weaver might run out of the brilliant dyes that came from distant forests. This collapse in specialized production meant that even local markets, the heart of a city's daily economy, would have withered. What was there left to trade when you could not even procure the raw materials? This economic strangulation worked in a vicious cycle with the drought and political strife. As cities became more desperate and unstable, travel became more dangerous, further discouraging merchants. As trade diminished, cities became more isolated and impoverished, making them even more desperate. The system did not just break, it unraveled, leaving each city-state alone and vulnerable, cut off from the very networks that had once been its source of wealth and resilience. The great stone plazas, once filled with the vibrant chaos of the market, fell into a silence that was both economic and profound. The very rituals meant to save them may have sealed their fate. At the core of the Maya world was a sacred bargain, a cosmic agreement between humanity and the gods. The gods had created the world and humanity from maize and water, and in return they demanded sustenance, a sacred substance the Maya called kayik, or life force. This life force was most powerfully offered through ritual bloodletting. A king or queen would pierce their tongue, their earlobes, or their genitals with a stingray spine or an obsidian blade, collecting the blood on strips of paper to be burned. The rising smoke was a direct conduit to the otherworld, a plea and a payment to the deities who controlled the rain, the sun, and the harvest. For centuries, this system seemed to work. The king's suffering brought the people's prosperity. But what happens when the offerings are made, the pain is endured, and the skies remain a hard, empty blue? A profound spiritual crisis began to unfold. The king, the Kuhol Ajor, was not just a political leader, he was the Axis Mundi, the world tree connecting the earth to the heavens. His entire legitimacy rested on his ability to communicate with the gods and deliver results. When the droughts persisted year after year, decade after decade, that legitimacy evaporated. The people's faith curdled into doubt and then into despair. You can almost hear the whispered questions in the dusty plazas. Why is the Holy Lord cutting himself if the rain does not come? Have the gods turned their backs on us? Has our king lost his divine connection? The desperation is palpable in the archaeological record. The elites appear to have doubled down, performing more frequent and likely more extreme rituals. The bloodletting ceremonies might have intensified. The focus may have shifted to human sacrifice on a scale not seen before, a final, terrifying attempt to offer the ultimate payment of life force to appease the angry gods. But no amount of blood could refill the empty reservoirs. The spiritual foundation of the entire civilization was not just cracking, it was collapsing into a void. The failure of ritual created a terrifying vacuum of meaning. If the king could not bring the rain, then the entire cosmic order was a lie. The carefully maintained calendars, the sacred stories of creation, the very purpose of their sacrifices, all of it was called into question. This was more than a political failure, it was a cataclysm of the soul. The people did not just lose faith in their ruler, they lost faith in the structure of the universe itself. What reason was there to stay and maintain the stone temples of a broken covenant? The abandonment of the cities was, in its deepest sense, a spiritual departure. They walked away from the silent pyramids not just to find water, but to seek a new understanding of the world. One that did not depend on a king who could no longer hear the gods. The great stone plazas did not empty overnight. The abandonment was a slow, relentless retreat, a tide of humanity ebbing away from the centers of power. It began with the quiet things. The sounds of children playing in the courtyards grew fewer until one day they stopped altogether. The rhythmic tap, tap, tap of the stone carver's tool, once a constant background hum in the city, fell silent, leaving half-finished monuments as eternal testaments to interrupted work. The market stalls, once vibrant with the colors of dyed cloth and the chatter of barter, were dismantled, their owners having packed what little they could carry. The city's heartbeat slowed, one family, one neighborhood at a time. They left behind the grand causeways and the soaring pyramids, not in a panicked flight, but in a somber, deliberate withdrawal. These were not people fleeing an invader, but a people voting with their feet, choosing survival over a broken promise. The intricate social pyramid, with the divine king at its peak and the farmers at its base, was dissolving back into the forest from which it came. The final resident of a great palace might have been a lone caretaker, a former noble who watched the jungle begin its patient reclamation. Vines would have crept over the lower steps of the temples. The first tender shoots of strangler figs would have taken root in the cracks between the stone blocks of the royal acropolis. Without the constant sweep of human feet, a carpet of leaves would have settled over the white plaster of the ball court. The silence that remained was profound, broken only by the calls of howler monkeys and the rustle of animals moving through what was once the city center. The population did not vanish. They dispersed, melting back into the landscape from which their civilization had emerged. They formed smaller, scattered communities far from the old political centers, living in simpler villages along rivers or near reliable cenotes, the natural sinkholes that provided water. Their knowledge did not die, it simply changed form. They still spoke their language, they still told the old stories, and they still planted their maize, but they did so without the weight of kings and the demand for pyramids. The great cities became places of memory and mystery, their stone skeletons slowly being swallowed by the relentless green of the jungle, waiting for a world that would not find them again for 1,000 years. Yet the story of the Maya does not end with the silent cities of the south. While the great centers of the central lowlands were being reclaimed by the jungle, a new chapter was unfolding far to the north on the flat limestone plain of the Yucatan Peninsula. Here, cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal did not just survive the chaos, they thrived, building magnificent new kingdoms that would flourish for centuries after the southern collapse. Their endurance was not a matter of luck, but a testament to a different way of living with a challenging land. The geography of the north presented a unique set of obstacles. Unlike the southern rainforests with their rivers and seasonal streams, the northern Yucatan is a vast, dry slab of porous limestone. There are no surface rivers at all. Water does not flow across the land. It drains instantly through the stone, collecting in a hidden, labyrinthine world of underground caves and sinkholes known as cenotes. For the Maya, these cenotes were not just water sources, they were sacred portals to the underworld called Xibalba. The entire existence of a northern city was dictated by its access to these natural wells. Chichen Itza, whose name means at the mouth of the well of the Itza, was founded around two massive cenotes. The most famous, the sacred cenote, was a place of ritual offering where precious objects and sometimes human lives were given to the rain gods who dwelled in the depths. But the city also relied on a network of other cenotes for its daily water supply, a resource that remained reliable even as the rains failed elsewhere. This direct access to the groundwater made the north inherently more resilient to the prolonged droughts that crippled the south. The southern cities had depended on elaborate systems of reservoirs and canals to capture seasonal rainfall, a strategy that failed catastrophically when the rains stopped for years. The northern cities, by contrast, tapped directly into the aquifer, a vast subterranean ocean that was far less vulnerable to short-term climate shifts. Their survival was quite literally rooted in a deeper source. This environmental advantage was matched by a profound shift in political and economic organization. While the southern cities were built around the cult of a single, divine king, the north seems to have moved toward a more collective form of leadership. At Uxmal, the architecture tells a story of shared power. The magnificent governor's palace, with its long, elegant facade, was likely a council house where a group of lords, rather than one absolute ruler, made decisions. This system, sometimes called a multiple or joint rule, offered a crucial flexibility. It was less vulnerable to the failure of a single individual. If one leader lost favor with the gods or made poor decisions, the system could continue. It was a government built for stability, not for the glorification of a solitary dynasty. This collaborative spirit extended to economics. Chichen Itza became the preeminent hub of a new, vast trade network that stretched across the Gulf of Mexico and possibly even farther. Its art and architecture show startling influences from central Mexico, including the feathered serpent god known to the Maya as Kukulkan. This was not a city looking inward, but one actively engaged with the wider world. Its great ball court, the largest ever built in Mesoamerica, was more than a sporting venue. It was a theater of diplomacy and commerce, where goods, ideas, and alliances were forged with partners from distant lands. This diversification made their economy far more robust than the insular, rivalrous systems of the South. When local harvests were poor, trade could bring in food. When one resource became scarce, another could be imported. The North, by embracing a new political model and tapping into continental trade routes, built a civilization that was not just different, but demonstrably more resilient. The gleaming pyramids of Chichen Itza and the poetic harmony of Uxmal's buildings are monuments to this adaptation, proving that the Maya spirit was far from extinguished. It had simply learned to build anew. There is no single date we can circle on a calendar for the Maya collapse. The silence did not fall upon the cities in one terrible, coordinated moment. Instead, think of it as a slow-moving wave of silence rolling across the landscape for more than 150 years, leaving each city to face its own unique fate in its own time. This drawn-out timeline is precisely what makes the mystery so complex. If a single earthquake or a singular invasion had struck, the story would be simple. But the reality was a protracted and uneven unraveling. A city like Copan in the southern highlands was one of the first to falter. Its last known monument was erected around the year 820, after which its royal dynasty simply vanished from history. Yet, at that very same time, a city like Sable, farther north, was experiencing a brief, final burst of artistic and political activity. It was as if the lights were flickering out one by one across a vast geographic stage, not in a single dramatic blackout. This staggered collapse challenges the very idea of a single cause. How could one drought or one war explain city-states failing decades apart from one another? The evidence points not to a single killer, but to a cascade of failures. A city's fate was sealed by its own local combination of pressures, its specific vulnerabilities. A city with deeper reservoirs or stronger trade alliances might have held on for another generation, while its neighbor, built on more fragile ground, succumbed first. This was not the fall of a monolithic empire. It was the slow, painful disintegration of a network, where each broken connection placed more strain on the ones that remained, until the entire web of civilization could no longer hold. The stones themselves tell the final, desperate chapter of the story. As archaeologists carefully peel back the layers of time, they uncover scenes of a civilization caught in a frantic, unplanned end. One of the most haunting signs is the unfinished construction project. At sites across the lowlands, you can find a pyramid that was never capped, its summit left as a ragged platform of stone. Or a palace annex where the walls were only partly raised, the masonry tools and piles of unused limestone still lying where the workers dropped them, perhaps for the last time. This was not a planned cessation, it was a sudden stop, as if the entire workforce simply walked off the job one day and never returned. The priorities of a society in its final throes had shifted from glorifying kings to pure, unadulterated survival. This desperation is etched even more starkly in the human remains. In some cities, archaeologists have uncovered mass graves dug not with ceremonial care but with haste. These are not the elaborate tombs of kings filled with jade and pottery. These are pits where bodies were placed without offerings, sometimes heaped together in a manner that suggests a single, catastrophic event, like an epidemic that swept through a malnourished population or a final, violent massacre. The bones themselves can be silent witnesses to the times. Skeletons from this period often show the clear marks of nutritional stress, their teeth lined with enamel hypoplasia, a permanent record of childhood hunger. These are not the remains of a people who faded away peacefully, but of a population pushed to its absolute physical limit. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing finds are the acts of ritual violence performed not on people, but on the very symbols of power. Scholars call these termination rituals. In the final days of a city, people would sometimes systematically deface the stone monuments that had defined their world for centuries. A stela depicting a king would be toppled and its carved face deliberately smashed away. The nose and mouth of a stone god would be chiseled off, blinding it to the world. In one particularly vivid example from the site of Piedras Negras, the carved throne of a royal dynasty was shattered into fragments. This was more than vandalism, it was a profound and symbolic act of destruction. It was the people severing the connection to the rulers and gods who had failed them. They were quite literally breaking the faces of the old order, ensuring that the power contained within those stone images could never harm or disappoint them again. Think of the powerful emotions behind such an act. It is not the rage of an invader, but the bitter, intimate fury of a community turning on its own heart. The farmer who had spent his life hauling stone for the king's pyramid now takes a hammer to the king's stone face. The act of destroying these monuments may have been a way to release their sacred energy, or perhaps it was simply to make a definitive statement that the covenant was broken and the rule of the Kuhul Ajor was over. These shattered stones are the archaeological echo of a final collective shout, a declaration that the Age of Kings was dead. The stone stelae were the royal news service of their time. These towering limestone slabs erected in the great plazas were the official voice of the Maya kings, a permanent record of their divine right to rule. For centuries, they told a consistent story of power, lineage, and cosmic order. A king would commission a stela to mark the end of a 20-year period in the long count calendar, using it to proclaim his genealogy, his military victories, and his sacred rituals. The message to the people was clear: your ruler is connected to the gods, and his success is your prosperity. But as the pressures mounted, the tone of these inscriptions began to shift. The narratives carved into the stone become less about cosmic balance and more about raw, earthly conflict. The later monuments are obsessed with war. Kings are no longer just depicted as ritualists, but as battlefield commanders, their glory measured by the number of high-status captives they took, often naming rival kings from neighboring city-states. The inscriptions tell of alliances formed and just as quickly broken, of cities being burned, and of royal dynasties being humbled. You can sense the growing desperation in this boastful rhetoric. It is the sound of a political system cracking under strain, where the only language left is that of domination and fear. Then, the most telling change of all occurs: the carvings simply stop. At Tikal, the last dated monument was raised in the year 869. At Palenque, the final royal inscription is from 799. At Copan, it is 820. After these dates, there is only silence. The great stone voices, which had spoken for generations, fell mute. This was not a coordinated decision. It was a city-by-city admission of defeat. The royal sculptors laid down their tools because there was no longer a king to glorify, or perhaps no one left who believed the story the stones were telling. The final stelae are like the last entries in a dying man's diary, full of the affairs of the day, with no indication that the end is near. Then the next page is forever blank. Yet the relentless drought was only one actor in a larger tragedy. The very land that fed the Maya was also being pushed to its limits. For centuries, farmers had practiced a form of agriculture known as slash and burn, clearing small plots of forest, farming them for a few years until the soil was depleted, and then moving on, allowing the jungle to reclaim the land. This system worked beautifully for a scattered population, but as cities grew to house tens of thousands, the demand for food became immense. To feed these urban centers, the Maya had to intensify their farming dramatically. They created vast, raised fields in swampy areas, built intricate terraces on hillsides to prevent erosion, and cultivated nearly every available patch of land. This was a remarkable achievement, but it came at a hidden cost. The soil, constantly planted with the same demanding maize crop, began to lose its fertility. Like a battery drained without time to recharge, the land's ability to produce bountiful harvests slowly diminished. Each season, the same field would yield a little less than the season before, a silent, creeping famine in the making. This soil exhaustion worked in a vicious cycle with another man-made problem: widespread deforestation. To make plaster for their monuments and temples, the Maya needed limestone. The process of burning limestone to create plaster required enormous amounts of firewood. Think of the sheer scale, coating massive pyramids and sprawling palace complexes in gleaming white stucco. The demand for fuel would have been staggering. Vast tracts of forest were cleared, not just for farmland, but for the kilns that powered the construction of their glorious cities. This deforestation would have had a cascading effect. With fewer trees to anchor the soil, the precious topsoil would have washed away more quickly during the heavy rains, further reducing agricultural yields. The loss of the forest canopy might have even altered local microclimates, making the land slightly drier and hotter, amplifying the effects of the larger drought. The environment they had so masterfully manipulated was turning against them. Then there is the silent, ghostly possibility of disease. The Maya were not an isolated people. Their trade networks reached across Mesoamerica, connecting them to other cultures. This exchange brought jade, obsidian, and cacao, but it could also have brought something far more deadly: epidemic disease. A trader traveling from a distant land might have carried a virus or bacteria to which the Maya had no natural immunity. In a densely populated city where malnutrition was already weakening the population, a novel sickness could have spread like wildfire. Imagine a fever sweeping through a community already on the brink, striking down the farmers needed to tend the fields and the leaders trying to hold order. There are no mass graves we can definitively link to a specific plague, but the sudden, rapid depopulation of some centers hints that something beyond starvation and warfare may have been at work. A pandemic would have been a final, devastating blow to a society whose resilience was already spent. The collapse, therefore, was not a simple equation with one variable. It was a perfect storm where environmental pressure, agricultural decline, and potential biological catastrophe converged. The drought was the match, but the kindling was a civilization that had, in its glorious success, made itself profoundly vulnerable. The echoes of the Maya collapse resonate far beyond the Central American rainforest. Their story is not entirely unique, but rather a powerful variation on a theme that has repeated itself throughout human history. Consider the Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire which dominated Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. For generations, the Akkadians ruled from their capital of Akkad, controlling a vast network of city-states through military might and sophisticated administration. Their power, like that of the Maya kings, was seemingly unshakable. Then, the evidence tells us, a terrible drought descended upon the region, a climatic catastrophe so severe it is recorded in the very dust. Archaeological sites show a layer of wind-blown sediment, a silent witness to centuries of aridity that turned fertile fields to dust. The empire's agricultural heartland withered. The intricate system of canals that fed their crops fell into disuse. The outlying provinces, cut off from the central authority and its dwindling grain stores, revolted or were abandoned. The empire shattered back into a collection of warring city-states, its grand vision of unity broken by an environmental crisis it could not withstand. The parallels are haunting, a civilization brought low when the environmental foundation of its power crumbled away. The Roman Empire presents an even more complex and drawn-out echo. Rome did not fall in a single day, but experienced a slow, grinding decline over centuries, a process historians still debate intensely. Yet within that long unraveling, we see familiar pressures. The Roman state faced immense logistical strain, stretching its legions and its bureaucracy from the misty borders of Britain to the deserts of Syria. This incredible complexity, this very scale that defined its glory, also made it profoundly difficult to manage. As political instability grew in the capital, with emperors rising and falling in rapid succession, the empire's ability to respond to crises weakened. Climate science now suggests that the period of Rome's troubles coincided with a less stable climate, including periods of cooler temperatures and poor harvests. This environmental stress amplified the social fractures. the Roman economy, heavily dependent on slave labor and vast agricultural estates, showed signs of stagnation. The heavy tax burden placed on the peasantry to support the immense army and the distant capital created a deep social resentment, not unlike the burden placed on Maya commoners to build ever grander pyramids. In the end, Rome did not so much collapse as it transformed, its western half fragmenting under the weight of its own complexity, internal strife, and external pressures. The story in both cases is not simply one of invasion or a single bad harvest, but of a system becoming too rigid, too strained to adapt when the world around it changed. What these stories reveal is a recurring pattern, a vulnerability that seems built into the very structure of complex societies. A civilization's greatest strengths, its dense populations, its monumental architecture, its intricate social hierarchies, can become its greatest liabilities. The Maya, the Akkadians, and the Romans all achieved breathtaking heights by creating highly specialized and centralized systems. But this specialization creates a kind of brittleness. When the climate shifts, when trade routes are severed, when the faith in leadership evaporates, the entire intricate machine can seize up. The common people, who for generations gave their labor and loyalty, eventually reach a breaking point. They withdraw their support not necessarily through violent revolution, but through a quiet, collective decision to walk away, to return to a simpler, more resilient way of life. This is the profound lesson whispered by these fallen stones. It suggests that resilience may not always lie in greater complexity or grander monuments, but sometimes in the ability to be flexible, to decentralize, and to live in a sustainable balance with a world that is never truly static. The silence of the Maya cities is a question posed to every civilization, a question about the true source of endurance in an unpredictable world. The end of the classic period was not the end of the Maya people. While the great cities fell into silence, millions of Maya did not simply vanish from the earth. They walked away from the political centers, carrying their world with them in their memories and their traditions. They dispersed into the vastness of the rainforest, forming smaller, more resilient villages far from the old stone plazas. Life did not stop, it transformed. In these new communities, the grand scale of kings and pyramids was replaced by the intimate scale of family and village. They continued to speak their language, to tell the stories of the hero twins from the Popol Vuh, and to plant their maize in the forest clearings. The complex calendar systems were not forgotten, but their use became more localized, guiding agricultural cycles and community rituals rather than legitimizing royal power. This was a return to a more ancient rhythm, a way of life that placed survival and cultural continuity above monumental ambition. The deep knowledge of the forest that had always underpinned their civilization became their primary tool for survival. They knew which plants could heal, which trees provided the best wood for homes, and where to find water in the seemingly trackless jungle. This decentralized existence offered a crucial flexibility that the rigid city-states had lost. If one village faced a drought or a crop failure, its people could move to a new area without bringing down an entire political system. The culture was being preserved not in stone, but in the daily practices of the people. Then, new influences began to drift into this post-collapse world. From the highlands of central Mexico, new ideas and people arrived, most notably groups influenced by the mighty city of Teotihuacan. This was not a violent invasion that erased Maya culture, but a complex process of cultural exchange and fusion. You can see this clearly in the art and architecture of the northern Yucatan cities that rose to prominence, like Chichen Itza. Here, the feathered serpent god, known to the Maya as Cuculcan, appears with a prominence that echoes the central Mexican god Quetzalcoatl. The architectural style incorporates distinct Mexican elements, such as the use of columns and elaborate facade decorations not seen in the older southern cities. This was not a surrender of identity, but an adaptation. The Maya were selectively incorporating new concepts into their own worldview, creating a vibrant new synthesis. They were proving their resilience once again, not by building walls against the outside world, but by engaging with it, absorbing what was useful and making it their own. The story of the survivors is a testament to the enduring power of culture, showing that a civilization can lose its political heart yet keep its soul alive for centuries to come. Centuries after the great cities were reclaimed by the jungle, a new and different kind of storm gathered off the coast. Spanish ships first appeared in the early 1500s, their sails a strange, terrifying sight on the horizon. For the Postclassic Maya, who had rebuilt their world into a network of smaller, thriving states in the northern Yucatan, this arrival did not at first seem like an existential threat. These were not the silent, environmental pressures of the past, but a direct and violent confrontation with a foreign world. The conquistadors brought steel, guns, and horses, but their most devastating weapon was one they did not even know they carried: disease. The peoples of the Americas had no immunity to the viruses of the Old World, and the results were catastrophic. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through Maya communities like a wildfire, spreading far ahead of the Spanish armies themselves. Entire villages were wiped out in a matter of weeks. The social and economic fabric of the post-classic world, which had survived the first collapse, was now torn apart by a biological catastrophe of unimaginable scale. This was a second, swift collapse, fundamentally different from the first. Where the classic Maya collapse was a slow unraveling from within, this was a brutal assault from without. The Spanish, driven by a zeal for conversion and gold, systematically dismantled what remained of Maya political structures. They burned sacred books, toppled idols, and built their churches upon the stones of ancient temples. The survivors of the plagues then faced the relentless pressures of colonization, forced labor, and the upheaval of their entire way of life. It is a profound and tragic coda to the Maya story, a reminder that a civilization can survive one great fall, only to be met by another of a completely different nature. The first collapse was a complex failure of a system under stress. The second was a deliberate and rapid dismantling by an outside force. That same silence that fell over the Maya plazas speaks to us across the centuries, not as a distant mystery, but as a sobering reflection of our own world. We face no single, simple threat, but a complex web of environmental and social pressures that feels hauntingly familiar. Our climate, too, is shifting in profound ways, bringing unpredictable weather, prolonged droughts, and rising seas that challenge the foundations of our societies. Like the Maya, our global civilization is built upon intricate systems of trade, agriculture, and governance that are both our greatest strength and our potential weakness. The interconnectedness that brings food to our cities and energy to our homes is a modern marvel, yet it also creates vulnerabilities where a disruption in one part of the world can ripple across the entire globe. The Maya story forces us to ask a difficult question: how resilient are we really? Their kings faced a crisis of faith when the rains failed, their authority tied to a promise they could no longer keep. In our time, we might see a parallel in the trust we place in our own institutions, in governments and international bodies, to manage global crises that no single nation can solve alone. The Maya commoners eventually walked away from the cities when the social contract was broken, when the system no longer provided them with security or a reason to believe. While our challenges are different in scale and nature, the underlying principle remains: a society's longevity depends on its ability to maintain the trust and well-being of its people, especially when faced with shared adversity. The Maya collapse was not an event but a process, a slow-motion failure where environmental stress exposed and amplified every political and social crack. We are now in the midst of our own process, watching as climate events strain resources, fuel migration, and test international cooperation. The lesson is not that we are doomed to repeat their fate, but that we have the rare opportunity to learn from it. Their history is a powerful reminder that civilizations are not permanent and that the most brilliant achievements can be fragile. It urges us to look at our own world not with panic but with clear eyes, to invest in sustainable systems, to build flexibility into our plans, and to remember that true resilience often lies in the ability to adapt, to cooperate, and to change course before the path ahead becomes impassable. The silent stones of the jungle ask us what we are building today and how well it will weather the storms of tomorrow. Even with the grand narrative of collapse laid out, so many intimate details remain lost to the jungle. We can map the droughts and trace the fallen monuments, but we cannot yet say why one city was left to the vines while another, like Lamani, maintained a community for centuries after its neighbors fell silent. What unique thread of resilience did some places possess that others lacked? Was it a matter of a deeper, more reliable water source, a more pragmatic and less rigid leadership, or simply the good fortune to be located on a still functioning trade route? The evidence presents a puzzle, a civilization that did not end with a single decisive event, but faded at different times for reasons we can only partially grasp. The precise trigger for the entire cascade remains just out of reach. We know the pressures, the drought, the warfare, the failing faith, but what was the final straw in each city? Was it a specific battle that broke their will, a particularly devastating harvest, or a plague that swept through a population already weakened by hunger? The collapse was a symphony of disasters, but we are still trying to identify the conductor, the moment when a difficult situation became an irreversible decline. These unanswered questions are what keep the story alive, reminding us that history is not a solved equation, but a conversation with the past, one where the silent stones still have secrets to share. The jungle has reclaimed its own, softening the hard edges of history into a landscape of profound peace. To walk among the ruins today is to step into a world where human ambition has been gently folded back into the earth. The Great Pyramid of Tikal no longer pierces an empty sky, but rises as a mountain among mountains, its summit brushed by the canopy of ceiba and mahogany trees. Howler monkeys call from the branches, their deep-throated cries echoing through the plazas where kings once addressed their people. The air is thick and warm, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. You can run your hand over a stone block, feeling the cool, rough texture where a master carver once chiseled the face of a god, now worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind. This is not a place of loss, but of quiet integration. Moss creeps over the steps of the grand ball court, and tree roots, patient and powerful, curl over the walls of the royal palace, stitching the stone back into the hillside. Sunlight filters through the dense green canopy in shifting dappled patterns, illuminating a carved glyph here, a corner of a facade there. The silence is deep, but it is a living silence, filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant trill of a toucan. It is the sound of the world breathing. To sit on these ancient steps as the afternoon light fades is to feel the weight of time not as a burden but as a lullaby. The stories of kings and conquests have been hushed, the urgency of rituals has faded, leaving only the stones and the forest in a slow, eternal embrace. This is the legacy the Maya left to the earth, a kingdom of green and stone where the past sleeps peaceful and deep under a blanket of stars. So we are left not with one villain, but with an entire council of calamities. There was no lone invader, no single earthquake that shattered the Maya world. Instead, the collapse was a symphony of disasters, where each instrument of decline played a part in a devastating harmony. The relentless drought was the lead melody, a haunting tune of empty skies and cracked earth. But this environmental pressure found a powerful amplifier in the rigid political system, where divine kings lost their sacred authority when their prayers for rain went unanswered. This crisis of faith then reverberated through the social structure, turning allies into rivals and neighbors into threats, as warfare and internal strife fractured the civilization from within. The intricate trade networks, the economic lifeblood of the cities, were severed, leaving each city-state isolated and starved of essential goods. Even the land itself, over-farmed and stripped of its forests for plaster and fuel, grew weary and less productive. It was a cascade of failures where each problem made the next one worse. A king fighting a war could not organize a regional response to the drought. A population weakened by famine was more vulnerable to disease. A city cut off from trade could not replace the tools needed to adapt. No single one of these pressures might have been fatal on its own. But together, they created a perfect storm, a convergence of environmental, political, and social crises that overwhelmed the brilliant but brittle system the Maya had built. The great cities did not fall to a single blow, but were slowly suffocated by a web of troubles from which they could not escape. This layered understanding does not simplify their story, but deepens its profound relevance, asking us to consider the complex and fragile foundations upon which any civilization is built. The true collapse was not of knowledge, but of stone. While the political order crumbled into dust, the Maya intellectual achievement was far too profound to simply vanish. Their legacy is written not in the fate of their cities, but in the enduring systems of thought they perfected, systems so advanced they still command our respect today. Think of their calendar, a masterpiece of interlocking cycles that wove together the sacred and the practical with breathtaking precision. The long count tracked vast, linear epochs, while the 260-day sacred calendar, the Tzolk'in, meshed perfectly with the 365-day solar year, the Hub. This created a grand cycle, a calendar round that repeated every 52 years, a rhythm that ordered everything from planting seasons to the timing of royal ceremonies. It was a conception of time not as a simple line, but as a complex, living spiral where past, present, and future were intimately connected. This celestial understanding was born from millennia of naked-eye observation. From quiet temple tops, Maya astronomers mapped the heavens with an accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. They calculated the solar year to be more precise than the Julian calendar used by their contemporaries across the ocean. They meticulously tracked the cycles of Venus, the morning and evening star, which they associated with war. Their ability to predict lunar eclipses and the movements of planets was not mere stargazing. It was a form of power, allowing priests and kings to align their rituals with the perceived mechanics of the cosmos. This deep timekeeping required a mathematical system of remarkable elegance and simplicity. While others struggled with clumsy numerals, the Maya invented the concept of zero, a profound abstract leap represented by a simple shell glyph. Their system was Vajsimal, based on the number 20, and used only 3 symbols: a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and the shell for 0. With just these, they could write any number imaginable and perform complex calculations that supported their astronomical predictions and massive architectural projects. This intellectual architecture was recorded in countless books, written on bark paper and folded like a screen. These codices were vast repositories of knowledge containing almanacs, astronomical tables, and ritual guides. The tragedy is that almost all of them were systematically burned by Spanish missionaries who saw them as works of the devil. Only 4 Maya codices are known to have survived this cultural holocaust, precious fragments that offer a tiny window into a lost library of genius. Yet the knowledge was not entirely extinguished. It lived on in the oral traditions of the millions of Maya who survived both collapses, passed down through generations in their communities. It lives on today in the 21 Mayan languages still spoken by millions across Central America, and in the continued practice of traditional ceremonies that honor the old cycles of the earth and sky. The pyramids may be silent, but the intellectual echo of the people who built them resonates through time, a quiet, persistent hum of genius that the jungle could not swallow and conquest could not erase. We have walked through the silent cities and traced the intricate web of their unraveling. The fall of the Maya was not a single event, but a whispered conversation between a changing climate and a civilization whose strengths had become its vulnerabilities. It is a story of brilliant adaptation followed by a brittle rigidity, a reminder that even the grandest human achievements are part of a delicate balance with the world around them. Their legacy is not one of mere mystery, but of profound instruction, showing us that resilience is found not in unchanging monuments, but in the enduring, flexible spirit of the people themselves. So as you drift towards sleep, let the quiet of the ancient plazas settle over you. Let the rustling leaves and the distant calls of howler monkeys become a gentle lullaby, a soothing testament to the fact that all things, even great kingdoms, eventually find their rest. May your dreams be filled with the peaceful green of the jungle, where history sleeps deep under a blanket of stars.